Hello guys, and welcome to the new episode called Nestjs config. And today what we are going to do is handling environment variables and read them into our Nestjs project. Usually what you do is in order to read environment variables you'll use a library, if you guys know, called .env. But however, we will try to do it in the Nestjs way for this video. And if you guys are aware, there is a documentation for it, for how to configure the Nestjs config in their website. However, we will try to do it as well in this video, and we'll do it in 3 different ways. Those 3 different options that I'm going to show you, you guys could combine them together or you guys could do it separately. But yeah, let's try it out from basics until we do it much more a sophisticated way of reading configuration. So first of all, what we'll have to do is what you could do is pull this repository and then later on work code with me. Go to the branch called tutorial nestjs config, or if you want to see the full project, completed project of it, you could go to the main branch, and in here in the main branch there is something called apps. Within apps there is a thing called configuration. So check this folder out to see how I coded in there. Now let's start. What we will do is go to our code. We'll say yarn, or actually go to the folder called Nestjs. Within Nestjs, now we have joined the Nestjs. Now what we will do is install the packages that are required. So what we'll do is yarn add nestjs config, which adds the configuration in our project. I hope that I didn't misspell it. Yeah, correct. Alright, this is for installation. Now what we will do is we'll start with the first way, which is how can we read an environment variable from Nestjs. So we have a file called .env in here on the Nestjs folder. So this env has one database URL and a port number. So it can be any environment variables that you have given here, it doesn't matter. But here we have a variable database URL and port. So the database URL is meant for the database that you want to run in your project, and the port is the Nestjs port that you're trying to run in here. The next step is, since we have the file called .env, now we need to read this file. So what we will do is go to our directory called apps. Within apps, we will go to configuration, and inside the configuration there is source, and in the source we will go to the basic module. As you guys know, if you guys didn't watch there, in Nestjs we have everything in module base. So in here, as I wrote it, we have a basic module, and within the basic module we have a file called basic module and a controller. So the controller will allow us to showcase or return the environment variables that it has listened on, and in the we will test it out. This is meant for just testing, and for basic module we'll do something. Now in the basic module, what we'll do is, in order for the system to read the environment variables in here, what you have to do is import a class, or like a class here from the nestjs config. So import this, so say nestjs config, and in here what we'll say is config module. Within the imports we'll use config module and mention for root, and there you go. Now our config module, or this module itself, will read all the environment variables we have in this .env. We could test it out by going to the basic. So what we will do is, we will, instead of returning null, what we will do is return a port and database URL. So here we'll say an object And then next step is we want to read the environment variables of these environment files that we have given here. How do we do that is first assign a const variable, and in here we'll say process.env, and process.env is all, like, it contains all the environment variables that you have put inside this .env. So for example, we have a port number that we put in here, port, and then as well we'll take the database URL called this. Let me verify if it's correct. Yes, it is correct. The next step is return the object, port, and database URL. Now what we need to do is check what kind of port number this server is running. So we will go to the main, and in here main, it's still running on 3000, so we'll have to change that a bit later. But now, for now, what we'll do is just run it and then work it out. Now there is a typo problem or a type problem, so we will say port, it will be, we'll cast it as number. Now the next step is we'll try to run this project by using yarn start dev, and then the project which is called configurations. Alright, now we will check the endpoint, and the endpoint is basic, so we'll just use the endpoint basic slash, and then it will return this port number and database URL. So we'll go to the page here. So let me go change this basic, and if you guys notice here, we got our port number and database URL. So if you guys know, here we have the port and the database URL, and in here we have the port database URL. So it worked fine. Now what happens is, in the basic module, so as a default, it always reads the file called .env, correct? But what if you wanna load it in a different file, folder, directory, whatever? You have here the root path, and then here you could say environment file path, where the file path is. So what we'll do is, for example, we have .env here, so we'll just say .env. But you could change it to something else, basic, whatever file that you have done before. So you could change the file path here. So this is just loading the path of the file. What we could do next is make it more much more user friendly here. Instead of using process.env.port, what we could use is a service from the Nestjs module that reads the environment variables instead of saying process.env.port. So what we'll do is go to, again, Nestjs config, and here what we'll do is import config service, and in here we'll say private read only config service in the constructor to inject the dependency of it. Now instead of calling it process.env.port, what we could do is we will use the service config service, so like this .config service, and get, and within the get function what we'll do is we need to put in the environment variable in it. Now we will do that just for the port to showcase how it looks like. So this is port number, and then we will go to the browser and just refresh, and if you guys notice, nothing changed. So you could do it in this way or process.env. I would recommend using this one instead of this process.env, because it's much more. What you could do is add more types. For example, here we'll say you will have an object that is of a port, like a field called port, and that is a number, so you could even mention it here. And then this port number, it will say there's an object, and that object has a port. So you could add type safety using this config service, but in process.env you're not able to do that. So again, recommended to use this config service. So basic is already done. Now what we'll do is in a different way. and the other different way is a different optional that you could have to read environment variables. So the next step is const config. Go to go to this directory, and in this directory you will find the same thing, but with different naming convention. So const config.module will have a module that has the config module.for root and the controller for testing purposes, and a folder called config. So within the config, this is where we will put in all the data or configuration that we have from the environment variables that we're reading from the config module. So this case is only when it's a preferable. Some people prefer this way because what you could do is assign as objects if you have too many environment variables. So for example, let's say we have here a variable here config, and here we have this interface. So in here in the interface, what we will say is make a type safe. So what we'll put in is all the environmental type variables that we'll possibly have, and let's say we'll have a port number and database URL. So that's the things that we need required. But let's say if you have too many environment variables, so what you could say, for example, is Nestjs config, for example. So you can make an object here, and you will say like all the configuration that is meant for the server. You could even make it more agnostic. So it's server config. Here is the port number that we require, and anything that is about database, you could make an object here as well. So database URL, like simple interface type. Now we have here iConfig that requires a server configuration object and database configuration object. Now what we will do is implement that interface by in our object called config, and in here it requires, if you notice, it will throw an error, and it's telling us to put all the information that we have here, that requires to be implemented in iConfig. So for example, we have a server config here, and the server config is the port number, and as well we'll have database that we require to fill up, and in here we'll have to say database URL. Now the next thing is, like I mentioned, usually there's another second option, which is here. Instead of putting everything like what we have done in the basic, is reading from outside of it, where we have here process.env. What you could do is instead put it in a configuration file, and inside the configuration file you could read the environment variables and everything in a much more preferable sense. Now what we'll do is here port, we'll say process.env.port. So now we renamed the name of port to much more like a JavaScript way, so lowercase, and here instead of calling port, we will say in this one lowercase port. Now that we will do that as well with database URL, so we'll do that as well. Now one thing though, again, it will tell us that this is a string, so we need to make it a number. So what we'll do is cast it again, so number, and then port here, and we are done, pretty much done. So now how can we use this configuration inside the, so how can we use this to read the environment variables? So what you need to do is const config module, go to that, and we will go to the for root, and inside the for root there is a function or a value called load. So load is the one that tells you to load the information here, and what we will do is load the configuration. So what kind of configuration that we want to load is the config. So now every information that we have is inside this config, but not this config. It will be in our import from the config file called config, and within the config file we'll load this configuration. Now it will load everything in here, so whenever the config module is starting, this config will be called, and this config module will contain all the environment variables that we have given in here. So to test it out, what we'll do is go to the config, and we could do a console log here, but let's just ignore that for now. But let's run this first. Yarn start dev configurations. We're good to go. Now to test it out, what we'll do is go to our const config controller, and inside the const config controller we'll read the port. So instead of calling this.config service.port, what we will use is something else, and that thing is the thing that we have done here, which is port and database URL. So here we'll call lowercase port, but instead of calling lowercase port, because this one is an object, so we'll say server config. So we'll use server config here, and here we'll call server config. And as well, we'll have another object called database. So we'll say database this.config service .get, and it will be database. Okay, now we got the object called database and server configuration, but without any types. So again, what we could do is use types, but the best part is we have an interface that has the types. So we'll say iconfig, and then here we'll use the server configuration of the type, and in here as well we'll say iconfig, and we'll use database. Now it's pretty much typed, it has the port number and the database URL. So now let's return this. What we'll do is port, server, and yeah, GitHub Copilot fills up everything, which is great. Now it is more typed, and we could test it out. What we will do is go to the page here, and instead of calling basic, we will use, hopefully the endpoint is const config. We'll say const config. Now if you guys notice, it has the same information, so that means it works fine. To show it what happened, so instead of calling the port, and instead of calling database URL, and ignore this type, so we'll instead use type inference. So here we could test it out, refresh it, and if you guys noticed, it says port, so it's an object, and here as well it is an object as well. So instead of, to make it more confusing, we will say server config and database. So in here, when we refresh, you notice that it is called server config object and database object with the URL itself. So again, this way, this option is like, you need, like, it takes some time to configure it, but the good part is if you have a lot of environment variables that you have to manage, and you don't want to have everything in capital, in capital letters, so it's preferable to use it this way, where you just have, like, for example, anything about regards to database, you could just add it in here. Like, for example, you have password that you want to add, so you could put password here. You could say, for example, schema, and then put here as well. And even server configuration, for example, you say course enabled, and you could say it's a boolean type, and you could put all the information in here, all the types that you require, and then you just have to fill up in the server config, like in the config.ts, this configuration object or the function, and just map them in each of them. For example, course enabled will be capital letters, course enabled, or you could even give them a default. So instead of even reading it, you could just say true, and in here as well fill up all the information in here that you require to do. So that's the second part, or the second option that you could do with the config module. So we'll move on to the third option, which I like the most. So let's go to that. All right, now let's go to the last option. So that will be invalidation configuration. So a brief information, what we are going to do here is, what we will do is validate the object. So whenever you, so for example, you forgot to add in like a port number here, and you forgot to fill up, like some like you work in a team and some people didn't fill up the information that you required to run this project. Some may have forgotten the port number. So usually when you run this project and go to the, for example, this const config, it will, the moment you run it, it will tell you that there is a problem. Like for example, the port number is null. However, it doesn't tell you before even running this project. So there is a better way of doing it, where before running the project, it will throw an error telling you that your environment variables, some variables are missing, or you could define these variables as a default. Like you could throw an error. So that's a brief information of what we are doing here. So this validation config allows us to validate the configuration that we are reading, the environment variables that we are reading, and if you're missing any values from there, we will throw an error before even running the project. All right, now in order to validate, we need to have a library or something that allows us to validate these environment variables. And I think you guys have heard of a validation library called Zod. Zod allows us to validate the information, like anything that you are putting it in, and it will give you a nice thrown error. You could use, like in the documentation, it tells you to use joy. So for example, where is the schema validation? Here it will tell you to use joy instead. But yeah, you could use joy, yup, any validation libraries that you're comfortable with. But yeah, at the moment, we'll be using, for now, this video we'll use Zod. Yeah, so let's install Zod. So we'll use this yarn add Zod and install this package. All right, now we will go to our folder called validation config. We will go in here, this directory, validation config. We have here controller as well, and our two files, config and config.interface. But it will be slightly different from our const config, so let's do that now. So first, what we'll do is go to the config.interface, and if you guys notice, the name, as the name is different, we'll call it config schema, which is creating the schema of the Zod. So this is not the Zod tutorial, but this allows us to take the shape of our object that we want to put in, or the object of the environment variables that we are putting it in here. So what we'll do is we'll define it here, z. So hopefully we have z, Zod, and then here we'll define this as an object. And within the object, what we require is a database URL. So we'll use database URL, and we'll define it as zstring. And as well, we'll require port, so it will be a Z number. However, this will throw an error because the port process.env.port doesn't give you a string, but it gives you it gives you a string instead of a number. So what we'll need to do is coerce, which will convert this port number to the thing that you want. Like for example, if this port number was a number, actually a number, it will return to a number. So I could show an example to you. So port, for example, it was 8080 because it was a string. It will convert to 8080 as a number. So simple that. You guys could check out the documentation for this part. So that's one thing. And database URL, as the name suggests, it will be a URL. So let's enforce this information. Even if someone fills this up into something, we want to make this as a URL because this one is a URL. So what we'll do is enforce this to become a URL. So now we're done with our configuration schema. The next step is we need to fill this, correct? So let's fill this up into an object. So we will go here in our project, and what we need to do is, so the config looks similar to our const config but slightly different, and the difference is here we are putting in a parameter a config file or config object that we don't know what kind of information we have, but using Zot we could parse this object. So what we'll say is const result, and in here we'll say we'll import our config schema, so say config schema, and use the function called parse from that schema itself. So this one will parse the configuration that we have into into a shape that we require, and two, it will throw an error if there's any problems with it. So we'll say result, and there you go. We have put in the information of the configuration in here. Now lastly, what we need to do is go to the config module. So within the configuration module, we'll go in here, and instead of using load, here we'll use something called validate. And this validate, what you could do is just put in the config file that we have in our configuration. So here, so this one will validate. So basically whenever config module reads this information, it will shove every data into this config function. Now if you guys noticed, my Nestjs is throwing error, and you guys could guess it, and the issue is it will tell you that there's a problem with the port. If you guys notice, it threw an error, and the error is regards to the port, and it says invalid type because we have commented out the port number in here. So let's try to uncomment it out and then run it again. So let's try to run this, and actually yarn start dev and configurations. Now there's no problems anymore. Now for example, we could mess up with the URL, so let's just remove this and let's try it again. Yarn dev, and yeah, I think I didn't put this as okay. So let me mess this up. This URL. Yep, I have messed it up. It will mention that, okay, it's not, okay, I commented out as well port number, but yeah, if you guys noticed, it says invalid string, invalid URL, because it's not the correct URL, and as well because I commented out the port number, so it threw an error. But let's say for example, we have the port number, but it has data, for example like a letter, and we'll say 8080, port 8080 with F. Someone messed it up with that, so we'll say configuration. Now if you guys noticed, it throws an error actually as well for the database URL and as well in regards to the port, because it expected a number, however it received none, which is like it's undefined, or it threw it's the type is different, totally different from what it expected. So let's fix this. Okay, we are fixing this, and there you go. Our project is running fine, and we have filled the information that is required our configuration, and as well we have validated the configuration that we have given to our project, and it will throw an error whenever you have missed information. Now we could give an example here. We'll say, for example, you missed out course enabled, right? So you just forgot there's course enabled as well that you require. It will throw an error. It will tell you that this is undefined. But what we could do is we could say, for example, as a default, it should return true. So then if that person forgot to put in the environment variable, it's fine because we have defaulted as true. And I think that's about it. So again, we talked about the first one, how to read the information, or like, I mean, the config module, you just have to import it. The next step is we have done two different other options, which is how do you read it in the as a variable, and as well how would you validate the environment variables that we have given to the person, or like to the server itself. Now, one thing though, what we have not done is using, because the funny part is we have been trying to do this configuration, the environment variable, but we never use that. We just test it out in the controllers. So for example, we want to use it in the main Nestjs because we want to change the port number. So what we'll do is here, in order to use config service in the bootstrap, what we need to do is use this root app. So that's the root application. So what we'll say is use this app, and I want you to return. So let me just use this, and then here I'll say return me a service called config service, and we'll define it as config service. Now we have done this. Now the next part is what we could do is get the port number, correct? Now let's log this, and we will get a port number which is 8080. Now we could remove this because we just tested out this. Now what we will do is we'll assign this port number in our listen, and let me just close this and run it again. And I think, yeah, one of my ports are already been used, 8080. So what I could do is change the environment variable port number to something else, 77, and I hope no one is using this port number. Correct, no one is using it. Now we could test it out. We'll go to our website. Instead of calling 8080, it will be 877. For you it will be 8080, but for me it will be 8077, and it worked fine. To test it out again, to verify it was actually working, so here we have 8077. Now that's how you guys could read it from within the main. If you want to put in some environment variables or something configuration here, for example, you want to add app dot enable course, and then here you could say, for example, if you enable the config service dot something, like whatever, you could enable the information of the things that you require for the system itself. I think, yeah, that's about it. And yeah, thank you very much for listening or checking out. So the full code will be inside this repository that I mentioned, which is this YouTube project. And either you could check out tutorials Nestjs with the current code that we have done, or the full project, which is under the main. And in the main you will find out under the apps directory, and under the apps directory there is a thing called configurations. So there is the full code in here, or you guys could try it out. So if you guys have any questions or any follow-up request videos that you want me to showcase in regards to Nestjs or Prisma or anything regarding programming, just let me know under the comments below. I think that's about it. Take care. Bye bye.